There has not been a general war in Europe since the downfall of Napoleon 85 years ago. Considering Europe's bloody history, that's a remarkable accomplishment. How was it done? Through an informal arrangement of great powers. It did not have an official name or a charter or a set of rules. It was no League of Nations, so to speak. It was just a group of powerful countries who, when trouble broke out in Europe, would call a meeting and hash out a mutually acceptable diplomatic solution. But it managed to keep the peace, more or less, for just shy of 100 years. It has come to be called the Concert of Europe. Welcome to the history of the 20th century. Episode 30, The Concert of Europe. Back in the late 18th century, the French Revolution had sparked a series of wars that had racked the continent of Europe for a generation. That's a literal generation, as in many of the soldiers fighting at the Battle of Waterloo had not yet been born when the wars against revolutionary France had started back in 1792. This was not the first time that Europe had been racked by a series of bloody wars, and Lord knows it will not be the last time. But in 1815, the Congress of Vienna was convened by the four major powers that had at last overcome Napoleon: Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia. These four powers were determined to prevent anything like what had just ended from happening all over again. And what came out of this conference was unprecedented. For the first time in history, the major powers of Europe had come to an agreement on a system designed to keep peace and prosperity over the entire continent. It was a plan for nothing short of eliminating war in Europe. It seems very idealistic and forward-looking, and it was, but it was also deeply conservative. As far as these four powers, all monarchies, although they represent a wide range of ideas about what a monarchy could or should be, from Britain's relatively liberal and constitutional monarchy through to Imperial Russia, where the emperor was absolute ruler and serfdom still very much a thing. Still, as far as these four powers were concerned, all the troubles of the past 25 years had sprung from a single diseased root: revolutionary republicanism. Republicanism in France had been crushed, or so they thought, and the French monarchy restored. As far as these allied powers were concerned, and the new French constitutional monarchy was in complete agreement on this, the peace of Europe depended first and foremost on preserving monarchy everywhere. This may be hard for us to understand today, but I invite you to put yourself in the shoes of a delegate at the Congress of Vienna. You've just been through decades of endless war triggered by a Republican revolution. In your time, ordinary people are poorly educated. Illiteracy is rampant, universal public education is still a pipe dream, and even the ordinary citizens who are educated and literate have probably never visited a foreign country or learned a foreign language. They know nothing of the larger world, just life in their own countries. Is it any wonder that Republican governments elected by such people invariably choose the well-being of their own home country over the peace and prosperity of Europe as a whole? In contrast, the aristocracies of Europe are highly educated and well-traveled. At the time, it was considered virtually mandatory for a young man coming of age in an aristocratic family to take a grand tour of Europe, usually accompanied by servants, translators, and tutors, and maybe a maiden aunt, to make sure the young man benefited from the educational opportunity. France and Italy were mandatory destinations. Switzerland and Germany, maybe. And given the Italians' laid-back attitude towards sex, There were additional educational opportunities if you could get away from the servants, translators, tutors, and the maiden aunt. As the 19th century progressed and transportation became easier and cheaper, these educational tours would become more and more elaborate and would take in more and more countries. Soon, even young women were going on educational tours. The point was, only the aristocrats truly understood international affairs. Only aristocrats grasped the complexities of foreign cultures. And given how frequently aristocrats arranged marriages across national lines, particularly in royal families where it is not unusual to find that a given king or queen is related to most of the reigning monarchs of Europe, aristocrats are bound into transnational family relationships and duties, quite apart from their national and patriotic obligations. Monarchs and aristocrats are therefore better positioned to weigh national and pan-European considerations against one another and make the proper decision. And then there's the simple fact that these four victorious powers, and then adding in France once she's safely back in the monarchical fold, they can pretty much dictate terms to the rest of Europe. And so they created an arrangement under which the boundaries of European nations were settled and agreed to. International disputes could be settled by calling a meeting of the five powers, and everyone has a monarch, like it or not. You may recall, for example, that when Greece won its independence from Turkey in 1829, the great powers insisted she be a monarchy, although it proved difficult to find someone willing to take the job, and the Greeks actually wanted a republic. The great powers settled on Prince Otto of Bavaria, who was still a teenager at the time, to be the first king of Greece, although he was still a minor and initially had to rule through a regency council. Appointing a Bavarian teenager to be king of Greece worked out about as well as you would expect. Similarly, the great powers chose a prince of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, Leopold, who was one of the candidates who turned down Greece 2 years earlier, to be king of the Belgians in 1831. Albeit at the more mature age of 40. Given all the social and the political and the economic and the cultural and the technological changes of the 19th century, it would be unfair to complain that this informal arrangement was unable to perfectly keep the peace. Better to be amazed that it worked as well as it did. The concert of Europe survived numerous upheavals. There were the liberal revolutions of 1848 and the reemergence of a republican France. There was rising nationalism that often rose in opposition to where the Congress of Vienna had placed Europe's borders. Not the least of these rising expressions of nationalism was the emergence of German and Italian nations in regions of Europe that used to be the playgrounds of Austria and France. And perhaps most seriously, there was the German annexation of Alsace and Lorraine following the Franco-Prussian War. The logic of the annexation was that a majority of the population of the region spoke dialects of German, and since Imperial Germany is all about the bringing of German-speaking people together under one flag, the annexation is just one more expression of Germany's reason for being. But the French did absolutely did not, accept the annexation. The French built statues mourning the loss of these territories. French maps marked Alsace and Lorraine in black. Every school child was taught that Alsace and Lorraine belonged to France. Yet Prussia had taken them by force, and no international conference is going to resolve that. Those of you who have read ahead in your history of the 20th century know that a great war is coming. But here at the History of the 20th Century, we like to take the chronological view. So let's put ourselves in the 1899 mindset, the time of the Hague Conference we saw come together last week. Modern histories of this era usually go something like this. In the period of time between the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 through to the Great War of 1914, two huge power blocks emerged in Europe. But the story is more complicated than that. If you could talk to an educated and informed European in 1899, and if you told them that a general war in Europe is coming, and asked them to predict how the great powers would line up during that war, you might be surprised by what they would say. It was far from a foregone conclusion. But one piece of the puzzle that our conversation partner from 1899 would probably guess accurately, and probably mention first, would be that the conflict would find France and Germany on opposite sides. A generation after the annexation, the French are as adamant that Alsace and Lorraine must be returned to them, as Germany is adamant that the territories are an integral part of Germany. The second conflict our friend would likely mention was Britain versus Russia. Over the course of the 19th century, Britain has become increasingly aloof from continental affairs. As an island nation with unquestioned naval supremacy, the British have little to fear from Europe. What they do have is an expanding global empire, and this empire is a much higher British priority. During the 19th century, when Britain got into a squabble with other European powers, it wasn't about anything in Europe, it was about some colonial dispute on another continent. Even so, as long as Britain rules the waves, no one is going to cut her off from her colonies. British policy toward Europe was to maintain a balance of power among the other great powers, and to use its good diplomatic offices to help mediate any disputes. But the British were also opposed to making any formal alliances with any of the other European powers, particularly during the premiership of the Lord Salisbury, who, as you may recall, liked to hold the post of Foreign Secretary himself. In 1896, a Canadian politician dubbed this policy splendid isolation. But what about Russia? Russia was also expanding its empire aggressively during the 19th century. And what's so annoying about this, from a British point of view, is that Russians don't need a fleet to do it, because of their privileged geographical position. Russia doesn't need a navy to get soldiers to the Far East. All it needs is a railroad line. And it's building one, the Trans-Siberian Railroad. In a pinch, Cossacks on horseback will do. Russia doesn't need a navy to get to China, or Afghanistan, or India, or Persia, or Constantinople. All these places the British send their amazing navy to are just a matter of marching for the Russians. The British war planner's worst nightmare is a Russian attack aimed at India. Now, from our modern point of view, we know that Russia is economically and technologically backward, and its army not nearly as threatening as it looks on paper. In hindsight, the idea that hordes of Russians are just going to march into India and expel the British looks kind of silly. But the British didn't think so, not at the time. Next to the French resentment against Germany, this British-Russian rivalry is potentially the most dangerous conflict in Europe. And our hypothetical conversation partner from 1899 would probably raise this dispute as well. In fact, she might very well suggest that a general war in Europe might erupt after the two conflicts align somehow. For example, Britain and Germany against France and Russia. Or, more likely, Britain and France against Germany and Russia. France and Russia were already allies, but then Germany and Russia had been allies in the past, and they had systems of government far more conservative and authoritarian than the French Republic. If you subscribe to the view that nations tend to line up with other nations with similar political philosophies, then you might be worried about the Kaiser and the Russian Emperor becoming buddies. My point is, when you look at the situation in Europe in 1899 closely, you don't see the emergence of two increasingly inevitable power blocs. What you see is a multipolar world with shifting alliances and national interests. And let's talk about Germany. German unification and the rapid military and economic rise of Imperial Germany was alarming to the French because it was making the odds of regaining Alsace and Lorraine look tougher and tougher. But it was not at all inevitable that Britain and Germany should become enemies. The royal family of Britain, including the beloved Queen Victoria, are ethnically German. Victoria is Kaiser Wilhelm II's grandmother. The Kaiser used to come to England every summer for the yacht races and would attribute his interest in building the German Navy to his British ancestry. Victoria took an interest in German affairs, and many people in the late 19th century pointed to Britain and Germany as countries bound together with common religious and cultural values. As I've mentioned before in previous episodes, the 1890s saw a diplomatic dance between Britain and Germany that might have, but never quite did, result in an alliance. That the alliance never happened reflects more Britain's lack of interest in having Germany as an ally than vice versa. What Germany brings to the table in an alliance is the most powerful army in Europe. But as long as Britain has her navy and is keeping aloof from European affairs, that's just not a draw. The Hague Conference opened in May 1899, 9 months after the Emperor Nikolai first proposed it. The great powers were wary. Lord Salisbury was skeptical. The Austrian Kaiser, Franz Joseph, was all too aware that Austria had a small army relative to its population with antiquated equipment, and couldn't see how an arms conference would do anything other than lock in Austria's disadvantages. The United States, just now flexing its muscles on the world stage, was also skeptical of accepting limits on a further buildup. But the biggest skeptic was Kaiser Wilhelm. This is the same Kaiser Wilhelm who once said, "There is no balance of power in Europe but me and my 25 army corps." Nikolai was married to the Kaiser's cousin and was 9 years his junior. Wilhelm was accustomed to writing Nikolai long letters in English full of patronizing advice, addressed to Nicky and signed Willie. When Kaiser Wilhelm first heard of the Russian proposal, he sent Nicky a telegram in which he predicted that honor will henceforth be lavished upon you by the whole world, even should the practical part fail through difficulties of detail. Although he also noted, imagine a monarch holding personal command of his army, dissolving his regiments, and handing over his towns to anarchists and democracy. On a memo from the Russian foreign minister explaining that all the Russians had in mind was some sort of ceiling on arms expenditures structured in a way that would not change the balance of power in Europe, the Kaiser wrote in the margin, "Idiot," and asked, "What will Krupp pay his workers with?" The German economy was booming. German industry was booming. And Germany's military was expanding rapidly in 1899. Arguments that the arms race had gotten too destructively expensive didn't resonate in Germany. Or maybe it was, as Count Eulenburg said, that the Kaiser simply can't stand someone else coming to the front of the stage. The Germans didn't want the conference, but they also didn't want to be the ones blamed for sabotaging it. So the German ambassador met with Arthur Balfour in London. You may recall that Arthur Balfour, Lord Salisbury's nephew, is filling in for him as foreign secretary now. The British didn't want the conference either, but were even less interested in being seen as responsible for killing it. And so the conference opened at The Hague. The Dutch capital seemed just the neutral ground Emperor Nikolai was asking for. Jan Bloch came and handed out copies of his multi-volume study on why a modern war would be a catastrophe, and did lectures and slideshows. Bertha von Suttner was there, and the hotel where she stayed flew a white flag in tribute to the famous peace advocate. Also present at this conference was the British journalist William Thomas Stead, fierce advocate for peace, women's rights, an opponent of child prostitution and the bloody atrocities in the Turkish Empire, Russia, and in the Congo. Stead famously highlighted the hypocrisy of late Victorian London, where the most respectable gentlemen of the upper classes, including reportedly the Prince of Wales and King Leopold of Belgium, were visiting brothels, taking advantage of the rampant poverty and misery in London to obtain girls in their early teens, who were then taken away, sometimes to other countries, for the pleasure of these respectable gentlemen. Stead proved his point by buying a 13-year-old girl named Eliza Armstrong for £5 and then writing an expose about it in his newspaper. It got him 3 months in prison, but the resulting uproar got a bill through Parliament raising the age of consent in Britain from 13 to 16. Count Münster, the German ambassador to France, in whose embassy the bordereau was first discovered, was a delegate at the conference. He wrote back to Berlin that the conference has brought here the political riffraff of the entire world, journalists of the worst type, such as Stead, baptized Jews like Bloch, and female peace fanatics like Madame de Suttner. All this rabble, actively supported by Young Turks, Armenians, and socialists into the bargain, are working in the open under the aegis of Russia. Andrew White, the head of the U.S. delegation, wrote, "The queer letters and crankish proposals which come in every day are amazing. The Quakers are out in full force. The number of people with plans, schemes, notions, nostrums, whimsies of all sorts who press upon us and try to take our time is enormous. And when this is added to the pest of interviews and photographers, life becomes serious indeed. For the first time in my life, I have made Sunday a day of work." The German military delegate at the conference, Colonel Gross von Schwarzkopf, made clear that Germany saw no need to limit arms expenditures. The German people are not crushed beneath the weight of expenditures and taxes. They are not hanging on the edge of a precipice. They are not hastening toward exhaustion and ruin. Quite the contrary. Public and private wealth is increasing. The general welfare and standard of life are rising from year to year. As for compulsory military service, which is intimately associated with these questions, the German does not regard it as a heavy burden, but as a sacred and patriotic duty to the performance of which he owes his existence, his prosperity, his future. The British and the Americans and the French agreed with the Germans privately, but were happy to have the Germans be the ones out there saying these things in public. The German government, as usual, seemed oblivious to the damage this was doing to its image. Not that the British weren't fighting tooth and nail against arms limitations. The British naval delegate at the conference was Admiral Sir John Fisher. He was Britain's first line of defense against limitations on the Royal Navy. His style was to say little at the formal meetings, to mingle with the other delegates and be charming. He had a reputation as the best dancer at the conference. His hoofing won praise even from Bertha von Suttner, and to privately lobby hard against arms limitations. The humanizing of war? You might as well talk about humanizing hell. The essence of war is violence. Moderation in war is imbecility. I am not for war. I am for peace. That is why I am for a supreme navy. The supremacy of the British Navy is the best security for the peace of the world. If you rub it in both at home and abroad that you are ready for instant war and intend to be the first in and hit your enemy in the belly and kick him when he is down and boil your prisoners in oil and torture his women and children, then people will keep clear of you. After listening to this, the German naval delegate wrote to Berlin that England is firmly resolved to employ with all cunning and ruthlessness the instrument of war which she possesses in her fleet, according to the principle, might is right. In the end, no agreement was reached on limiting the sizes of armies or navies, or in slowing the introduction of more modern weapons. Perhaps because the failure of the conference to produce any tangible agreement was beginning to embarrass the delegates, they were more open to some of the Russian proposals to ban new types of weapons that had not yet been introduced. One such weapon, one that most delegates were happy to discuss banning, was the expanding bullet. These are hollow bullets that are designed to change shape and grow wider when they penetrate a body. This makes them less likely to pass all the way through their victim and more likely to stop an animal or human being in their tracks. They were a British development and were often called dum-dum bullets, after the British dum-dum arsenal outside Calcutta, where they were originally developed. The British Army delegate, General Sir John Ardagh, argued furiously against banning dum-dum bullets, saying, "The civilized soldier, when shot, recognizes that he is wounded and knows that the sooner he is attended to, the sooner he will recover. He lies down on his stretcher and is taken off the field to his ambulance, where he is dressed by his doctor or his Red Cross Society according to the rules of the game as laid down in the Geneva Convention. Your fanatical barbarian, similarly wounded, continues to rush on, spear or sword in hand, and before you have had time to represent to him that his conduct is a flagrant violation of the understanding relative to the proper course for the wounded man to follow, he may have cut off your head." So we need our dum-dum bullets to use against the barbarians, you understand. In the end, the conference voted to ban expanding bullets, with only Britain and the United States opposed. The United States intended to use them in their war against the Filipino guerrillas. Torpedoes were a new technology at this time, and they kept a lot of naval planners up late at night, fretting about the potential threat that small speedboats armed with torpedoes might pose to all those beautiful modern battleships. Torpedo boats, and their more muscular cousins, destroyers, would indeed come to play an important role in 20th century naval warfare, though they would not decisively displace the battleship. Even more scary to the naval planners were the new experimental underwater torpedo boats, what we call submarines, that might sneak up on a battleship and sink it entirely undetected. The British had the most battleships and the most money invested in battleships, and consequently were the most keen on banning submarines, although in the end the conference took no action on banning them. Then there was this topic of dropping bombs from balloons. The Russian military delegate, a Colonel Jelinsky, put the view of his superiors like this: "In the opinion of the Russian government, the various means of injuring the enemy now in use are sufficient." The conference almost voted to ban bombing until Alfred Thayer Mahan objected. Remember him? The author of The Influence of Sea Power Upon History? He was there as the U.S. naval delegate. He argued that dropping bombs from balloons might shorten wars and therefore, in the long run, be more humanitarian. Since no one knew for sure, the necessary technology not yet being in place, the conference compromised on a 5-year ban to be reviewed at a future conference. The conference also voted to ban the use of poison gas, again over the objections of Mahan, who argued that he couldn't see how filling the lungs of soldiers with poison gas was any crueler than filling the lungs of sailors with salt water following a submarine attack, and yet the conference didn't want to ban submarines. Then there was the subject of arbitration. As I mentioned last week, the peace movement hoped to create an international system of binding arbitration to resolve disputes between nations as an alternative to war. Binding arbitration turned out to be a non-starter at the Hague Conference, but the British proposed the creation of a permanent arbitration court at The Hague, which would be perpetually available for voluntary arbitration of disputes between nations. Kaiser Wilhelm absolutely hated this idea. German war planning was heavily skewed toward a rapid mobilization. This was how the Prussians had won the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. The idea was that Germany could mobilize a huge army and strike before its opponents could fully prepare. In the Kaiser's view, all this talk of arbitration was a device to slow things down just long enough to neutralize the German mobilization advantage. As the talks went on and the arbitration plan took shape, the Germans became more and more isolated. Eventually, Andrew White, the chief American delegate, persuaded his German counterpart that if Germany successfully sabotaged even voluntary arbitration, perhaps the central idea of the peace movement, the Russian emperor would look like a hero for proposing it, and the German Kaiser would be cast as the villain. Wilhelm reluctantly accepted this argument and consented to arbitration, although he wrote, "I consented to all this nonsense only in order that the Tsar should not lose face before Europe. In practice, however, I shall rely on God and my sharp sword." He also made one other comment, but I can't repeat it on a family podcast. The conference also agreed to a new convention on the laws and customs of war on land and new rules for maritime warfare. They also agreed to meet again in 5 years, although, spoiler alert, the Russo-Japanese War would force a postponement of that meeting. So the conference had made some minor progress, although the peace movement was disappointed. Bertha von Suttner wrote in her diary, "Cold, cold are all hearts. Cold is the draught that penetrates the rattling windows. I feel chilled to the bone." In 1902, Baron d'Estournel, a French diplomat who had been one of the French delegates at the Hague Conference and later became a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration and also recipient of the 1909 Nobel Peace Prize, met with President Theodore Roosevelt. The French diplomat was concerned that 3 years after its establishment, no country had brought any case to the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and he was worried that it might drift into irrelevance. President Roosevelt turned to his Secretary of State, John Hay, and ordered him to find some kind of dispute to submit to the court. Hay quickly found one, an old dispute between the United States and Mexico over Mexico's financial liability to the Catholic Diocese in California, former Mexican territory ceded to the United States in 1848. This became the first case brought to the court. The U.S. won, and Mexico paid the church. And later that same year, as we've already discussed, Britain and Germany imposed a naval blockade on Venezuela after that country defaulted on its foreign debts. The United States sent its own fleet under the command of Admiral George Dewey, you remember him, right? And successfully pressured the British and the Germans to take that dispute to the Permanent Court of Arbitration. The Permanent Court of Arbitration is still in operation to this day. You can find it in the Peace Palace at The Hague in the Netherlands. We'll have to stop there for today, but I hope you'll join me next week on the history of the 20th century as we take on the topic of the Russo-Japanese War. We'll begin next week with the run-up to the war, and I guess now I can stop saying spoiler alert every time the subject comes up. That's next week on the history of the 20th century. Oh, and one more thing. I described in last week's episode how Bertha von Suttner won the 1905 Nobel Peace Prize, and I mentioned how Jan Bloch was nominated but never won. William Stead was also nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1901, 1902, 1908, 1909, and in 1912. But he never got one either. He might have won in 1912, but they don't give out posthumous Nobel Prizes, and he died at sea on his way to a peace conference at Carnegie Hall in New York City that year, when the ship he was on struck an iceberg and sank. The name of that ship was Titanic. The sensational news story that Stead had created by buying 13-year-old Eliza Armstrong is said to have inspired George Bernard Shaw to write his stage play Pygmalion, with the name Eliza Armstrong changed to Eliza Doolittle. Shaw's play and the 1956 American Broadway musical adaptation, My Fair Lady, as well as the 1964 motion picture adaptation of the same name, have been enormously influential in 20th century popular culture, and variations of that Pygmalion story have been told and retold on the stage, on film, and on television ever since.